Hi there, this is Deb Rooney, the Department of Learning Health Sciences at the University of Michigan Clinical Simulation Center. Today we'll be talking about rater training for performance assessment. Before we get started, I'd like to acknowledge the CERT program, the Center for International Reproductive Health Training at the University of Michigan, for sponsoring today's module. In this module, I will be reviewing the considerations of training raters for performance assessment, as well as reviewing the steps used to prepare raters for effective assessment. Here are the 4 steps, and we'll begin by looking at finalizing your assessment tool. So although there are different steps associated with finalizing your assessment tool, today our target will be predominantly on step 4, training the instructors and assessors on tool use. If you'd like to learn more about finalizing your assessment tool, please see the module associated with adopting performance tools at your own institution. Let's go ahead and get started on training our raters. There are 4 primary strategies for training our raters. I'll talk about them a bit at the 3,000-foot perspective, and then we'll do a deep dive. The first one there are 4 primary strategies for training raters, and we'll talk about them at the 3,000-foot perspective and then do a little bit of a deeper dive. The first strategy is rater error training, where we make raters just simply aware of the types of error they may be introducing inadvertently by their own rating behaviors. The second, performance dimension training, or PDT, is where we target raters' recognition of the appropriate behaviors associated with different dimensions or domains of assessments. For example, an assessment for code management, where there may be 2 separate domains for communication and managing the actual patient, and we train the rater to discriminate the different behaviors associated with each of those domains and rate them accordingly. Third, we have frame of reference training, or FOR, and this actually helps raters discriminate the nuanced variations in the quality of the demonstrated skills. And finally, behavioral observation training, where we help raters develop their observation skills at detection of particular trigger events and the events that are leading up to that triggering event, so they'll be keenly aware of making sure that they are assessing only those events. For more detailed descriptions on these particular training strategies, please see Feldman et al. 2012, the reference below. First, let's go ahead and do a deeper dive on rater error training. So there are all kinds of different errors that we can introduce as a rater. These ultimately then may introduce different biases, and this is simply based on the personal way that we do performance rating. We have 11 here, there's quite a few, but today we're going to be focusing on just 5. These are the most prominent types of error and biases one might introduce during rating. So the halo effect is where a rater perceives one factor as most important relative to the other factors, so it actually gives a good rating and ignores the poor quality of other factors in the event a trainee performs exceptionally well on one part of a performance versus poorly on the others, and ultimately the rater then gives them an overall a good rating. On the other side, we have the horns effect, where in the opposite language, the rater perceives one factor as particularly poor compared to other factors that the learner may have done quite well at. And so ultimately, that rater gives them a poor overall rating. Either way, this rater is unable to discriminate between the learner's strong and weak points, so that must be addressed. Contrast effect is where we have a rater score of one learner is influenced by the relative performance of a prior learner's performance. And what that means is that, just referring to their own memory, a previous trainee or learner's performance may have been outstanding. And therefore, the trainee that's in front of them now that they're assessing may be relatively weak. And therefore, this rater will then give the second trainee poor ratings relative to the first, and therefore undo harsh or severe ratings. Central tendency, which is different than contrast effect. In many ways, the rater actually avoids the extreme ratings, generally from their own insecurities as a new rater. Perhaps they don't want to be different from other raters, so the natural tendency is to rate in the middle of the pack, and therefore they do not see the specific nuances of the good or the poor performances relative to that particular trainees. So they are unable to discriminate between the learner's strong and weak points, and hence kind of mush everything in between, and that is typical of a new trainer. So central tendency. In central tendency, the rater avoids extreme ratings, and for whatever reason, generally out of insecurity because they're new raters and they don't want to stray too far from other raters' ratings, they tend to rate middle of the pack, and everyone in the middle of the pack, or every learner's each item's middle of the pack, and therefore they are unable to discriminate between the learner's strong and weak points. That also needs to be addressed. Most commonly, we have personal rating biases, and we talk about these quite a bit, and by this we'll talk about leniency effect. And finally, we have personal rating biases. First, we have leniency effect, where the rater score is relatively high when compared to other raters, and we often refer to these folks as doves. On the other side of the coin, we have hawks, where we have the severity effect, and raters score relatively low when compared to other raters. And this is typically not a problem as long as we recognize a particular rater has this type of bias, either a low or high effect, and we generally can take this into account, especially when they're rating low or high across all learners. That's the important thing. It's only when we have particular biases for particular learners is when we have problems. Doesn't mean we ignore it. We just have to be aware of it and address it in our computations sometimes. The pros of rater error training we talked about primarily are associated with the awareness of raters and their own rating styles. However, on the con side, because raters are more sensitive to their own rating patterns, this tends to result in overly cautious ratings and leads to inaccurate ratings, which ultimately leads to unreliable ratings. Second performance dimension training, or PDT. What we're talking about here is a way of doing effective mass training, and typically it allows or offers a description of a skill and the specific behaviors, and generally it's written. And so here we have an example of a test that's fairly well known called the Fundamentals of Laparoscopic Surgery, and which consists of 5 domains. In this case, these 5 domains are tasks. Here we see task 1, peg transfer, and to give you an idea of the description, this written description they offer, we'll read a little bit. To perform this task, grasp each object with your non-dominant hand and transfer the object midair to your dominant hand. You will then place the object on a peg on the opposite side of the pegboard, and so on. There is quite a bit of detail, so the raters learn over time the nuances of the behaviors, not the quality of the behaviors, but the actual behaviors that they need to observe and mark. Are they doing this? Are they not doing this? Or do they need to interfere if the test is not going, the behaviors are not going as they should? Most of the time, a video is also supplied to the training raters, meaning the new raters, so that they can also watch the videos, look at the description as well. This type of training is particularly good when you have dichotomously score rating scales. For example, they need to make sure that the learners are doing something or they're not doing something. And in this case, for the FLS test, if the learners are not doing the correct sequence, then the raters will step in and redirect them and ask them to do the correct sequence. In other times, if they're not doing something, simply they just rate it, check yes, they did it, or no, they didn't do it. It's quite straight up. Pros It's very quick training and easy to disseminate to multiple raters, which is great. And also the raters do become very aware of the proper procedures and behaviors, particularly over time. In terms of the cons, though, the raters do require quite a bit of experience to become reliable raters, to understand these proper procedures that are quite detailed. This being said, raters may not be aware of the nuances between the qualities of performances that oftentimes are used to differentiate between poor and good performances. So this type of training is very good for those dichotomously scored assessment tools, not so good for training raters who use polytonously scored scales, such as a Likert scale or a 5-point scale. Frame of reference training, OFOL. Let's talk a little bit about that. This is typically done in a 3-step process. And what I do is I use a focus group environment. And in the first step, we have new raters using the planned tool, and they watch videos, they practice rating a range of performances using the tool. And then what we do is we analyze a second step, the rater agreement or reliability. Oftentimes, if that's not done, we can use means to compare the new group of learners with the gold standard expert. And then eventually we do talk about this, and we discuss the discrepancies in rating either overall or at the item level, and then this is able to recalibrate the learners, and then we do the sequence again to allow them more practice to hone in and recalibrate their ratings to be closer to the gold standard. What we do also is in those discussions, and we talk about the nuances of the qualities, as we talked about, of the behaviors in reference to the scoring metric. Here we have this overall performance as an example with a range of 1 to 5 rating scale from very poor to clearly superior. And oftentimes the discussion is relating particularly to this difference between a subcompetent and competent performance, and that is where a lot of the discussion lies, to make sure that raters are understanding that nuanced behavior quite well. So they're using these scores and the rating scales the way they're intended. Pros of frame of reference training is that the raters do become very aware of the nuances between those qualities of performances, and those are used to differentiate between the poor and the good performances, which is great. On the con side, though, they are the most time-consuming, and they may require multiple iterations to calibrate and recalibrate raters over time. So this needs to be a consideration during the use of this type of training. Finally, behavioral observation training. And what we do here is we review videotape or live observation, and the focus is a bit different. It reviews the trigger items with the raters in the context of a particular scenario, so they can anticipate these triggering items, so they can describe the behavior, the magnitude, and the frequency of what those triggering items are. The pros, raters become very aware of trigger behaviors, which is great, but the cons are the raters may become so sensitive to seeking out those trigger behaviors that they may overlook uncommon behaviors that should be recorded, perhaps a decision to push a specific drug that's not in the typical algorithm or the approved algorithm, those kinds of things. And those are notable, but often could be overlooked if it's not trained in on the initial training of the raters. Of these 4, they're all good for different purposes, and typically for performance ratings, I prefer to use the frame of reference training and the behavioral observation training, oftentimes in combination. So that's something to be considerate of. It's not a one-size-fits-all, and it depends on what your needs are at your own institution. The third step is evaluate ratings. This is pretty straight up in terms of evaluation of ratings is done using the data from the first cohort of learners in their first assessment experience, using the new tools and the new raters. Typically what we do is we videotape the learners' performances, and we still maintain a live rater at the bedside or during that training event, which allows feedback to the learners, which is very important. We then have our additional new raters assess the performances via the videotape using the proposed rating scale or assessment tool, and then we look at the rating differences and we compare them just like we did in the frame of reference training. We compare those to the gold standard, and we also compare the ratings across all raters to ensure reliability. Digging a little bit deeper into this, I know a lot of people are not very comfortable talking about statistics, but it's really not too tough. In an ideal world, we at a minimum, we want to look at Cronbach alpha, which is a correlation coefficient. Anything equal or greater than 0.7 is considered acceptable. We also would like to see rater agreement through interclass correlation, which over 0.5 is considered acceptable. And I'd like to see that if we have enough ratings and if we have enough items on a scale. Do that for overall, and then given propensity of data, I'd like to do it for each item. Sometimes we cannot do it for each item because the amount of data is limited. It's something to consider. Now, in the event that we may not be statistically savvy or you need to do something quite quickly, simply comparing the means of the new raters to the gold standard, again for overall or each item, is something that you can look at and get that information quite quickly. If you'd like to learn more about the process for using interclass correlation, there's this resource below from Dr. Todd Grand. It's on YouTube, and you can access that via the QR code below. Just scan that with your phone. Finalizing this, we need to talk about retraining raters. This does happen, and typically the way that I think about this is I like to always review the trends, definitely want to identify the hawks and doves, and if I can, reorient them and recalibrate them with just a simple conversation. What this means is I basically just look at their overall means and compare them to other raters, and sometimes just simply pointing out that they are a hawk or a dove is enough, and we allow that to happen. Now, sometimes folks need a little more information, a little more evidence, so I might share the index called the Cronbach alpha if deleted, and that's available through SPSS and described through Dr. Todd Grand's YouTube video as well. And this might be enough to recalibrate raters. If it's not, we might have to do a full retraining of the rater again, and this is time consuming, but what I would do is I would use either the frame of reference or the behavioral observation training methods and the target assessment tool, and I would frame the training in terms of nuances and items. Typically that's where the problematic rating comes in. And then what I would do is, as an individual, is I would observe that rater work through a performance video as a sample, and I would ask them to do a think aloud as they rate the performance using the assessment tool. And finally, at the end, I would debrief, and again, I would discuss those nuanced problems and differences in discrimination. Particularly, I'd want to make sure that they can discriminate between a marginal or a poor performance versus an acceptable performance. That's important, and that is using the frame of reference framework. And then also, sometimes we need to discuss those critical trigger behaviors or the behavioral observation training framework. So it depends on what's necessary for a particular learner or a particular rater, but certainly that is the way that I would go about doing it. Finally, if ratings continue to be unreliable, you can and should remove a rater. This is a tough decision because raters don't come easily, and especially when you invest the amount of time in them. But sometimes we have a particular rater that just doesn't line up with the standard that you prefer, and they should be removed. And that is always a consideration and an option if you need that. Remember, raters are the foundation of your assessment program, and they certainly set the example by setting the standards for your assessment program. In spite of this, needing to be rigorous, they still need to be sensitive to learners' developmental needs and provide that so important feedback to the learner. So finding a good rater is difficult, but it is possible. Noting that the best raters do recognize the importance of this rigorous assessment plan and provide meaningful feedback to your program director to create and implement the most effective assessment plan. Finally, we hope that this module helps you apply the best approach for rater training, ideally early in implementation of your assessment plans to ensure the long-term value of your assessment. In the end, we really want to ensure a defensible and practical performance assessment plan. Here are references, including the QR code for the interclass correlation YouTube from Dr. Grand. And certainly, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to contact me.